Rob Greenway is here. He's the director of the Allison Center for National Security at the Heritage Foundation. And Heritage is just out with one of its most important and interesting reports released each year. Rob, good to have you with us, sir.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much for having me.
The Heritage Foundation each year releases this index of military strength. Give us a sense of what it assesses and what you found.
You bet. For 10 years, we've provided this report card, essentially, of our armed forces. We look at really four things. We look at the threats to U.S. interests. We look at the operating environment at which we'd have to face them and confront them around the world. We look at our armed forces collectively and their capability and capacity to meet those threats. And lastly, we also address our partners because obviously they play a role in it. And the story we've told consistently for 10 years using the same comprehensive evaluation and consistent measurement is the threat environment is increasing and our capacity to address those threats is declining to a very concerning level. In fact, the last 2 years, we judge our armed forces at being weak.
It's unfortunate to hear. So I want to talk about some of the primary components here. The threat environment. Let's begin there. What does the threat environment look like, and how has it changed?
Well, I think no need to remind you and your listeners that the world's situation is deteriorating in front of our very eyes,
yes.
And at a rapid clip the last 2 years because of the Biden administration's policy. So whether it's the open borders here at home, or whether it's a land war in Europe and the Russian invasion of Ukraine that they failed to deter and haven't been able to conclude, or it's the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and now the Hamas attack on Israel of October the 7th and the escalation that includes firing U.S. ships at the Red Sea on a daily basis and attacks against our forces in Iraq and Syria on an hourly basis, while we're funding Iran and its terrorist surrogates and proxies to do it. And then you look at the increasing threat from North Korea and their ballistic missile and nuclear program, and the threat in the South China Sea from an increasingly emboldened and aggressive China. No matter where you look, or I could add Venezuela claiming territory from its neighbor Guyana. No matter where you look around the compass, things are getting worse, and they're getting worse at a faster pace, and that affects our ability to address threats, no question.
Yeah, the problems are all over the place. And as you mentioned, our border, I mean, the cartels have never been more empowered, and the threats to the country and the American lives that are being lost are very real right now.
Oh, there's no question. Yes, over 3 million crossings at the border. You know, how many thousands of special interest aliens coming from places like the Middle East or military-age males from China. The drug cartels, as bad a problem that is, resulting in 100,000 deaths a year for the last 2 years from fentanyl-related overdoses,
yes,
has a Chinese origin at the end of the day. All of this, of course, is opening it up to threats that we face around the world.
All right, so we've assessed the threat picture, the threat environment. Now let's talk about our capabilities. What has changed about our military and its readiness?
So really, since the end of the Cold War, we have declined our investment. We thought that the Soviet challenge went away, that our military was preeminent, and it was, and in some ways it still is. But we have not updated our weapon systems, for example, across the board in large measure since the 70s, right? So we haven't bought a new major land weapon system since the 70s, it's generations ago. And we don't, in many cases, have projected replacements for it. We're flying aircraft that were designed in the 70s and fielded in the 80s in most cases, and we're training less. And we've got a smaller army and military across the board suffering from the worst recruiting crisis in the history of the all-volunteer force. We missed our goals by 41,000 service members last year alone. And so the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy particularly, we can't man the equipment, which is old enough, in order to meet the threat. And our nuclear inventory isn't faring any better. Our weapon systems designed are very old. Our infrastructure is ancient. Our workforce responsible for building that, 50% are eligible for retirement. And the Chinese threat is increasing apace, and we're not keeping track with that threat, and it's overcoming us.
Well, we're also exhausting our stockpiles of weaponry in the proxy war that we're fighting in Ukraine. So it's that, you know, we've got a lot of weapons that are going out the door, and not quite as many weapons left in our stockpiles, are they?
No, that's exactly right. And we have really been depleting our stockpiles for 30 years, but now the pace has increased. And so we're launching Tomahawk cruise missiles and expensive interceptors against very inexpensive Iranian modified Chinese cruise missiles and drones. And the cost proposition is good for our enemy, but it's terrible for us.
You have assessed, in this report, you've assessed the relative strength of each of the different branches of the military here in the United States. And I don't know if you've got the details in front of you, but to go through all of them. But what I find interesting is that, first of all, unfortunately, you've got the Air Force listed as very weak. That's a tough label to hear for the United States Air Force. How did that happen?
Well, there are really two reasons that impact it. I already mentioned the fact that we've got aging planes. You know, you might drive a 40-year-old car across country, but you probably wouldn't want to fly a 40-year-old plane in enemy-held territory, a hostile environment. But that's what we're doing. Second, we've got fewer service members to man our older equipment. As I said, the recruiting crisis is impacting all services, including the Air Force.
Yes.
And lastly, training, where our aircraft pilots, our fighter pilots in particular, are spending less than 130 hours a year, 130 hours a month training, and they really ought to be north of 150, which was the sort of Cold War standard. And our adversaries are training, north of 170, 180, which is, again, and that's sufficient to maintain your skills. Our pilots, unfortunately, are not keeping up with their skills.
Let me move up from there. The Navy is assessed in your report as weak. Why is that?
Again, we've got too few ships to meet the threat. We can't confront threats in the Middle East, in Europe, and certainly against the Communist Party of China with the number of vessels we have. It's been legislatively mandated to have a certain size fleet. We're not there. And we're not on track to get there. Second, a lot of our fleet is old and suffers from maintenance issues. And lastly, the Navy, again, is not exempt with the manpower crisis from the recruiting shortfalls. So we have old platforms, too few sailors to get out there, and not enough to cover the pacing threat for the Chinese. And let me add one other thing. We can't project and sustain our Navy on the other side of the Indo-Pacific. That requires fuel, ammunition, transport, and storage capacity that we don't have a plan to reestablish it. And then you add the defense industrial base, which really undercuts the capacity to resurrect this capability across all services.
As you're describing this, it sounds like you're sounding a very loud alarm about the state of our military right now. I want to move to the Army.
Yeah.
You say the Army is considered to be marginal right now, and my understanding is that also has to do with the recruiting problems.
It does. And frankly, the only reason it got marginal and not weak is because the readiness, as reported by the Army, and we don't have the ability to contradict them. And I'm not suggesting they're dishonest in this, but they're reporting that their readiness levels are exceptionally high. And you would hope so coming after 20 years of conflict. But we have too few personnel in our Army. And of the 51 brigade combat teams that we suggest, we're nowhere near meeting that goal. And that was the requirement for quite a while. And now that we're insufficient at meeting it because of the recruiting crisis, we're almost accepting that lower force strike number. And the most recent NDAA basically poured cement around it and suggested that was satisfactory, and it is not.
You also assess that the Space Force, I think even these days, I feel like not a lot of people think about the Space Force all the time, but it's out there thanks to Donald Trump installing the Space Force. You also assess that at this moment that they are marginal.
So they are in the sense that we're not developing capacities apace, but it was successful at consolidating all the disparate responsibilities for space across services. And the United States, fortunately, is still leading the way in launches thanks to SpaceX and commercial programs. So we're still leading. However, the Chinese and others are on track to outpace that in capacity and capability. So we're not going to hold that advantage for much longer.
All right, so let's get to the good news of this report then, at least based on the label. You do have the United States Marine Corps listed as strong. They're the one branch that you assess that way. Why?
So the primary reason is, and it's the smallest of the forces, we have to admit that, they're not suffering as yet from the recruiting crisis the other services are. They're the only ones so far that have made their goals, and I hope they continue to do so. The real reason we assess them as strong is because they've made the decision to adapt the force and make bold decisions to confront the Chinese Communist Party threat and the People's Republic of China, and they're doing it. And so they're on track at a major transformation to adapt their force structure and size to meet that threat. And we judge that they're making progress that can be accelerated, but they're on pace to do it. And again, they're meeting their recruiting goals and retention goals for the moment.
How much, in your assessment, how much is kind of the left-wing ideological meddling disrupting the ability of the military to be both strong and successful?
Well, From our judgment, the impact is absolutely present. And we're getting that anecdotally from service members within and those that separate. And basically, the plot here is that as we place goals, which are quotas, make no mistake, across the services, and particularly the Air Force, on ethnicity and the composition of the officer corps in particular, we're replacing meritocracy as the sole arbiter for promotion and for advancement and for leadership in our armed forces, which is essential for success in combat. And we're replacing it with some other criteria. And every time we've done that in our history, one, we have poor performance, and two, we have trouble keeping people in the armed services, and three, we have trouble getting people to join the armed services. And we're seeing all of that in spades. Now, it's difficult to measure it, to quantify the impact it's having, but we know from service members it's there. And let me add, it's not just the active duty, it's not just the armed forces, it's also the defense industrial base. It's not immune. You know full well that Boeing is under the microscope right now for what happened at Air Alaska and that door and other issues. And the question now is, are we promoting people in the workforce based on something other than skill, other than merit? And the question is, yes, that is being done in companies and corporations. And our judgment, that's impacting things like the F-35 technical upgrade, the TR-3 program, which is a software upgrade for the most part. In our judgment, and based on the information we have, that it's not a supply chain issue, really. It's a coding issue, and it's because Lockheed almost certainly has advanced persons because of some other factor other than skill, merit, and performance.
Also, I know that members of the military, certainly within this audience, have been very concerned about the ideological pressure that they're under while they're working in the military, not just in and as you point out, the kind of the racial prejudice that's employed in hiring and promoting, but also in the pressure campaign to get a government-mandated jab during the COVID pandemic, or the kind of the like all of this pressure to the extremism stuff. Remember, the Biden administration said that the real problem in the military is all of this right-wing extremism. A report just quietly coming out in December indicating that was a complete lie. There is no massive problem of, quote, right-wing extremism, but it did engender a lot of suspicion amongst the ranks between various members of the military, which is not healthy for a military unit that is supposed to maintain some troop cohesion. These seem like big problems.
Oh, there's no doubt. And they're all symptoms pointing in the same direction, right? So you're forcing service members who are not in any high-risk demographic by any stretch of the imagination, and all the data support the conclusion. And then you're forcing them to get an experimental inoculation, including those that have legitimate reasons and why they have either religious or medical reasons for not getting it, and yet they were separated from the service. And as you rightly point out, we did a massive hunt for the phantom of extremism that we knew that didn't exist in the military ranks. It's always been a point of scrutiny. And so these are indications that there's a priority other than performance. And when you do that, you break the trust between leadership and the led. And it shows up in recruiting. It shows up in retention. It shows up in things like suicide rates, which I'd add to that list of things that are deeply concerning. Our suicide rates for members in active duty and veterans are higher than they've ever been, and they're not going down, they're going up. There's no reason for it. It is inexplicable.
Suicide rates among active duty and veteran are higher than they've ever been at this moment?
They are still climbing. And to be honest with you, there's no rational explanation. You'd expect it, during a period of high intensity deployment, especially we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we're on the other side of those deployments right now. And so you have to wonder, what is the stress within the force right now that is causing it? And it's not combat deployments, and it's not recovery from deployments. It's not that stress. So what is it? And we don't have an answer for it, but it's not something that's really being addressed. And it exists not just in active duty, but also in our veteran population. It is a problem, and it is not going away.
I'm sorry that I didn't know that reflexively. I'm glad you told us today. Thank you very much. I'm going to pay attention to that. Rob Greenway with the Heritage Foundation, and an important report on the state of our military. If people in our government care about that, they'll pay attention to this report. Thank you, Rob. Good to talk to you today, sir.